This is Free to Exchange, the show where free-thinking scholars, free markets, and, ironically, free public television all meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. On today's show, we're going to discuss the rise, fall, and stagnation of one of the world's largest economies, Japan. Then in the second half of the show, we're going to explore what's lurking behind the scenes in our own economy and others throughout the world, shadow economies. My first guest is a friend and colleague at Texas Tech, Dennis Patterson. Dennis is professor and chairs the Department of Political Science here at Tech. He's an expert on East Asia in general and Japan in particular. He's the author of Japan That Never Was, explaining the rise and decline of a misunderstood country. And, like me, he's an import to West Texas, originally from New England. But we'll try to keep our accents under control for you all. Dennis, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here. Really, really happy to be here.
All right. Well, it's going to be fun talking with you. So let's get started with kind of what was going right in Japan. So end of World War II, their economy's in tatters. They just had a military dictatorship. They're bombed out. I mean, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are literally nuclear bombed.
That's right.
And then just decades later, beginning of the 1980s, everyone's saying, Japan Inc., what's going on there? We need to be more like them. They went from obliterated third world status kind of to one of the models for success. What kind of started by going right there?
Well, what went right was they started from the bottom. They were a developed country prior to World War II. And, you know, at the same time, the world economy expanded where more people came out of poverty and experienced prosperity than any time in human history. So the Japanese just rode that wave. As they rebuilt themselves with American help and had free access to the American market and expanding markets around the world, they got lucky. And the high growth was really an artifact of that period of time. And with the fact that we promoted free markets around the world, set up the post-war institutions that promoted, you know, the decline of tariffs and other kinds of things that promoted free trade that allowed Japan to expand its own domestic economy and to experience the benefits of an expanding world trade system.
Yeah, I think so. But these people are going to know they got two New England on us today when we start rattling back and forth quick like this.
That's right. We talk fast.
Yes, we do. So yeah, I think one thing that you said about free markets, that's important because they had something in common with a lot of other East Asian tiger economies at the time now. As we go through that list and think about post-World War II successes, you know, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, they all seem to have that in common, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And what we also forget is they all had really high quality educated labor forces because of their K-12 education systems. That's what Japan had. And as you know, the post-war world economy developed, they were also able, because they were rebuilding, to make sure that they were at the cutting edge of all the kinds of new technologies that were necessary. Because they had heavy chemicals, you know, they had steel, chemical industries, you know, they built fantastic, you know, apparatuses for war. And so they took that ingenuity that they already had and then just built on it as the post-war economy expanded. And they were right on the crest of the wave.
Yeah, they're certainly probably the prime shine, or them or Hong Kong maybe the prime shining example, just Japan's bigger.
That's right, that's right. And then Korea now, look what's happened to Korea. I mean, Korea went from a country that was behind the Philippines in 1970. Now, we don't remember that, to now it's one of the, you know, top members of DAC, one of the 14th or 13th, 13th largest economy in the world.
Right, or
I mean, it's amazing.
Half of Korea, right?
Well, that's true, South Korea.
But this is the lesson about institutions, right? If South Korea adopted the institutions more like Japan and these other Asian tigers and exploded, and meanwhile, North Korea, of course, we all know, is heavily intervention communist, actually.
And it had, I mean, it's a human tragedy because as much as 70-80% of the population is malnourished there because they don't have any economy whatsoever.
Right.
It's terrible.
Yeah. So some people will say, and I know this is something that you've addressed in your book a little bit here, as well, you know, you can say that thing about good institutions and free markets in Asia, but, you know, Japan had MIDI. It was the Ministry of Trade that was planning things there. We need government planning of industry. What do you say to those people? Well,
you know, we've had a long debate about this. Matter of fact, that was the motivation for the book. So what I would say is, bottom line was, what we've explored is we spent a summer in Japan where we were actually at MIDI. And you know, the funny thing was everyone said MIDI drove the economy in Japan. We looked in every room in the whole agency. We couldn't find the room where the economy was driven in Japan.
You didn't see a steering wheel and some levers.
I didn't see the carburetor where they were tuning the economy of Japan. And that. It looked like every other government agency building I've ever been in my life. Aside from that, what we did is we took all the industrial policy tools that all of the revisionists and all of those who said Japan had done something new that we ought to learn from, and took those tools and divided the country into the 13 two-digit economic sectors and saw who got what. Now, every sector got something in the post-war period, so we looked at relative sums, which is what you do as a good economist, right? And what we found was exactly what you'd expect if pork barrel politics was the rule and not industrial policy. The lowest growing, weakest sectors got the most attention. That's trade protection, that's low interest loans, that's direct subsidies, and that's tax breaks. In other words, the country grew in spite of its pork barrel politics. In other words, the high growth period was an artifact. In other words, people said this is archetypal Japan. It's growing and therefore we've got to be a high growth economy like Japan. But they didn't look what really happened. They said that what they do is they took the outcome as cause.
Right. So, I mean, there's some cases of, so I understand that these low growth industries got it from the Liberal Democratic Party that was ruling Japan, right? But there's others, like, Sony we think of as quintessential Japan. Didn't they have problems with media being able to export to the United States?
Absolutely, yes. Media was actually more of an interfering type agency because it kept them from getting the kind of foreign exchange that they needed and stuff. And that's a wonderful case because I love the case of Sony. And because Sony, says, and this is Akio Morita, and because it talks about differences between what we do here. First of all, what we don't understand is ownership and management is the same in Japan because these companies started from scratch, or they kind of rebuilt themselves like Mitsubishi. So you have this no separation of ownership and management like you have here. So that's why salaries of owners are much lower in Japan. And that's why, the whole enterprise union system, which is not like our large trade unions, structure here we have here. These are, from top to bottom in the same countries, which is why they could absorb a little bit of a hit better than we could in our economy. So, but the point of this is he said, look, no market is more complicated than the American. This is what the owner of Sony said. No market is more complicated than America. I don't know why Americans don't come here. We had a hard time getting into America. And as a matter of fact, we were blocked by our own agencies, like Meaty. He said, this is true. Made it harder for us. Honda, same thing.
Yeah. There was something where they tried to merge the auto firms together.
That's right.
Or something like that in the 60s. And of course, this is a shining success now of Japan.
Absolutely.
So this is their success story then. They grow with good institutions. Media was around and meddling, but it wasn't doing enough harm to actually stop it. But the Japan, most of our viewers are probably familiar with now is the basket case. That was the 1990s and then the kind of stagnation the last dozen years or so. So the Nikkei ran way up in the 1980s. Real estate prices were through the roof. Then all of a sudden this comes tumbling down at the beginning of the 1990s. What went on?
The interesting thing is Japanese operated under the three myths, as we call it. Growth would always be positive, real estate would always grow in value, and assets, stocks and stuff would always grow in value. Wrong. Because they were fed by this revisionist idea that Japan had invented a new style of economic thinking and actually a different kind of economic system that could defy the economic laws of gravity. Let me tell you, the value of land in Tokyo itself, just the city of Tokyo, in 1989, which is just a little bit smaller than Harris County, was worth more than all of the land in North America. North America. Now, you and I both know this is a bubble. Japanese said, don't worry about it. We'll just keep leveraging our loans and keep lending because the banks were really strong. And that was currency realignments that did that. And so what happened was they believed that this bubble would never burst. And you know what? You can't sustain a bubble like that. That bubble was beyond any, you talk about our housing bubble, that bubble was really something. Yeah. And you know what? When it came crashing down, the companies lost 2/3 of all their value.
2/3 of their value. And some of the real estate was an even bigger plunge, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah. I mean, because the way they showed profits was, first of all, they weren't making money in the markets. They showed profits by this bubble because of the assets they held and the stocks they held kept going up and up in value. That's how they were actually showing profits, not through their cash flows and sale of goods.
So what did the government try to do to fix this when the bubble collapsed?
Well, the first thing, much of the government was vested in the old system. I mean, that is protecting small and medium-sized businesses, which were very inefficient, the construction industry, and farming. And they realized that in order, if we're going to get back and really be a partner in the world economy, we're going to have to make some reforms. And that's a very difficult thing to do if you're old-style politics. So it got started with two things, an institutional change and then a new government of the old system that said, we're just going to do this because we've got to, because we've had 10 years of nothing, what they call the lost decade.
So, because during the 90s, they did big fiscal stimulus packages, right? That was part of Tokyo Bay Bridge. And
that's right.
and they put their monetary policy right down to basically zero interest.
Zero interest. I mean, almost negative. Yeah, right. I mean, to the extent that you can do that. That's when you run deficits. Your interest rates are effectively negative in that sense, which is interesting when you think about it. But they just kept pumping money. But the problem was Japan went through a structural adjustment. They were vested, that is to say, they had productive capacity in markets that weren't growing for their products because they couldn't afford it.
They had the wrong capital in the wrong industries, and they weren't structurally adjusting. And were those interventions just trying to keep that capital there?
Exactly. Mazda is an example. I mean, Mazda wanted to build a new plant, so they went to their Keiretsu Bank, which is Sumitomo, before the banking system reorganized, said, give us so much so we can expand this plant. They said, have 3 times that amount, because they were sitting on cash. That's why they were buying assets at like Rockefeller Center and Pebble Beach and stuff. Japanese banks were awash with cash. So what do you do when you're awash with cash? You lend it. And what they did is they lent it, just assuming that those 3 MITs would stay in operation.
Right.
And guess what? The market collapsed.
All right, so we get the lost decade. Then, beginning of the 2000s, we started to see some reform.
That's right.
What's going on now? And real quickly, we're almost kind of out of time here. Where are they at now, and can we be optimistic, or what do they need to do?
You can be optimistic. They're struggling, but the current regime is actually, his name is Abe, and they call him Abenomics, which is Abe's version of economics. And what he's finally doing, I mean, there were reforms started in 2005 by a former Prime Minister, Koizumi, who's a friend of George W. Bush's. Right. And he started the reform bill, which is you've got to get out of the way. When you have a structural adjustment, the best thing for the government to do is get out of the way. And provide the incentives, be it tax and other, to allow the private sector to make the kinds of structural changes in investment that it needs to become productive again. And that's what's going on. We're finally seeing the benefits of what started in about 2005 in earnest, pulling back on these fiscal stimulus packages and really letting the economy do it. Because Japan is a wealthy country, and it did muddle through for years and years. And finally, you're starting to see the benefits of this. Now, it's a mature economy, so it's going to grow slowly, but it will get back.
Well, that's good to hear. I look forward to visiting there again and trying some of that wonderful sushi that they have around the fish market.
It's you can eat well in Japan.
All right, well, thanks again, Dennis.
Thanks, Ben. It's been a real pleasure.
Up next, shadow economies, black markets, and backroom deals. Intrigued? Stick around. We'll be right back.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
You have a straightforward choice before you.
And you think I should choose life?
Come back here, Pookie!
We wanted to send Carl out by simply doing a good radio show.
Why start now, Peter?
Tell me what your understanding is of what happened.
Come on, snap out of it, will you? You're on National Public Radio.
Once you become part of the Red Raider family, it's forever.
Lubbock's just not a bad place to be or be from.
You were going to keep that.
That is so cool.
Welcome back. I'm pleased to have Kate Sheehan with me. Kate just earned her PhD in economics from West Virginia University, and she recently joined Texas Tech's Free Market Institute as a postdoc research fellow. Some of her research is related to today's topic, shadow economies. And besides, who better to talk to us about shadow economies than someone coming from a state known for secret stills and backyard booze? Kate, welcome to the show and to Texas Tech more generally.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let me first ask you, before we get into the topic then, you're moving from West Virginia University to here. You're going from the mountain state to flat Lubbock. Now, are you going to become a Texas Tech football fan?
Except for when they play West Virginia.
That was the next question, except for when they play West Virginia. We'll have to take that for now. So let's get into today's topic, shadow economy. So first off, tell us all, what is a shadow economy?
So a shadow economy is just people that are actively buying and selling goods and services, but doing it in such a way that they're not being detected by the government. So it could be something as simple as not fully reporting the amount of tips you get if you're a waitress.
Okay.
Or paying your employees under the table.
Or that backyard booze if you had brought some from West Virginia
moonshine
with you. Now, by the way, in case there's a tax collector watching, I'm not saying Kate did bring moonshine with her, but if you had, that would be part of this.
Right, that would be part of the shadow economy or the underground economy.
The shadow or the underground. So when people hear this, they probably also think like black markets and drug smuggling. Are we talking about that too?
Well, so when we talk about the shadow economy, we talk about activities that would be legal if it weren't, or people would normally have in the normal market if it weren't for these regulations and these taxes. So it's not capturing things like the drug trade.
Okay, so the drug trade's out, or if I pay a hitman, that's out. It's just things that are basically trying to avoid tax compliance mainly?
Yeah, tax compliance, and then if there are a lot of regulations. So maybe you can't set up your business properly because of how much you would have to pay for unemployment insurance, or...
Okay, so your business would be legal if you went through the regulatory steps, but you're just saying, to heck with it, I'm not going through.
It's too much work, I can't do that right now, I'm going to stay outside of that formal market.
Okay, so do we have a shadow economy then in the United States?
Yeah, we do. So the shadow economy in the United States is actually one of the smaller. It's only about 8% of the GDP for the United States.
Maybe it's relatively smaller to the world, but that still seems big. I mean,
right.
8% of our economy is just underground to avoid taxes and regulatory compliance?
Well, and in the United States, it's only 8%, but it's only to avoid these taxes and these regulations. Otherwise, it could be legal versus, in Zimbabwe, when you get up to like the 60% of the GDP, right? Part of that's taxes and regulations, but that's also part of like property rights and lack of a rule of law in those countries.
Okay, so is the United States common with other European countries then, and 10%, something like that?
Yeah, we're actually lower. So like OECD countries tend to have about a 16% GDP, of GDP that's in their shadow economy.
Yeah. Actually I experienced it last year. I was in Eastern Europe and I was on a bus trip. And twice we were part of their shadow economy because the bus trip at one point, the bus shut off and the driver took out his employment card and put in a different employment card because he had violated the number of work hours.
You can only drive so many hours.
You can only work so many. It also almost stopped me from tasting at a wonderful vineyard. There was a vineyard there that was by a legendary California winemaker who had gone back to his home country of Croatia and opened it up afterwards. We went like 2 hours out of our way on a bus trip just to stop at the vineyard. And we're knocking on the door, they won't answer. She finally comes around, and because they live on the property, she said, "It's just my husband and I working here, and we've already worked all of the hours." Actually, she didn't tell me at first. She just said, "Come on in, but can you pay in cash?" We said, "Yes, we can pay in cash for a tasting, no problem." And then when I bought wine, she said, "But no credit card." And I said, "Okay, no credit card." She said, I'm like, "No problem." She's like, "Good." Some people get angry because they don't understand why we can't do it on the weekend. I'm like, "You mean you can do it during the week?" She said, "Yeah. My husband and I, we've already worked all the hours we're allowed, so you're just here as our friends, but give me cash."
All the numbers they're allowed?
All the number of hours they were allowed. Her husband, they were out, but they were happy to keep working if they could do it under the table. So that's the shadow.
That's the shadow economy we're talking about.
And that would explain why places with big labor market regulations like that in Europe have a little bit bigger one than the United States.
Right, than in the United States.
All right. So tell me then around the world then, so who are the best or the smallest shadow economies, and who are the biggest?
So the smallest shadow economy would be like the United States and Switzerland and Austria.
Okay.
And those all come in at about under or just around 10% of their GDP.
Who are the disasters?
Zimbabwe,
okay.
Panama, and because there's like 60% of their GDP. So it's
over
actually larger
economy.
Than their formal economy.
Wow. In Zimbabwe, I guess that's not surprising. It's their formal economy is just completely
right. I mean, they can't. Their currency over the last few years.
Right. Second highest inflation in the world happened in Zimbabwe.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I have like $1 billion or $1 billion whatever Zimbabwe note in my office. So what is it that that really drives and causes shadow economies then?
So shadow economies are going to grow when citizens start to feel like overburdened by the state. So when they can't do the activities that they would like to do. Our shadow economies supply goods and services that people want. So they grow when it becomes too high of taxes, too much regulation, when you need to avoid corrupt government officials maybe, like that would happen in like Panama or in Zimbabwe.
So we shouldn't take like a policy lesson from this that says these shadow economies are huge in these poor countries. We need to stamp out the shadow economy.
No. So, I mean, the shadow economy is largely what's making those countries run. Once you get up to 60% of your GDP, or even as low as like 25%, if you were to stamp out that shadow economy, it would be a disaster for those countries.
So really the question then is, what's a better way to get rid of the shadow economy? We don't want to, the key question is how you get rid of your shadow economy. It's nice that the United States only has an 8% one,
but it's still an 8%.
Like, it's not. We don't want them to ramp up the enforcement and stomp out this 8% in the U.S. either.
Right. Well, because so one way that you could look at getting rid of it is looking at why people are operating in the shadow economy. So in a country like Zimbabwe, you could really look at why they're doing it and then try and legalize or formalize some of the rules that are allowing that shadow economy to operate so well there. Having an easy tax system like a flat tax rate or just one that's highly visible would help out, and not making it difficult to start and allow businesses to fail.
Mm-hmm. So like the World Bank has this index, the Doing Business Index, and you see some countries—
Less days, not more.
Less days, not more. So this index tracks the number of days it takes, the number of procedures it takes, and how much money it takes to start a legal business. And the United States, it's super easy like that, doing business as, and you get going. But in other places in the world, it takes—
I mean, the more steps you have to take, that's more opportunity to have to bribe an official or for like discretion on the government to make it more difficult for you to do that, right? So you want to make it as easy as possible to start a business and as easy as possible to allow a business to fail, right? Because if I know I can't fire my employees if my business is doing bad, I'm not going to go in the formal economy either.
Mm-hmm. So some of these places, it's ridiculous. It's like it takes a year to register your business, and it takes 200% of average income in this country. It's like,
right. And by business, we're not talking about like a brand new bank or something. It can be something very simple that like a corner market store even is taking a year to start up in these countries.
So the way to get people out of the shadow economy is to make the rules for the formal economy better so they don't go into the shadows.
Right.
That's kind of the punchline. But if we just tried to stamp out the shadows, that wouldn't work.
No.
I actually did, and this was I had a hard time publishing this paper actually. It was on corruption and economic freedom.
Okay.
And it was kind of a pushback against the international community that was like, well, we must stamp out corruption. And I'm like, well, it depends how. Like,
maybe it's making it work.
It's making conditional on having bad rules, it makes it better. We don't want the bad rules, but if we have bad rules, it's better to get around them. I mean, the extreme example is, Nazi Germany, you want Schindler, there we go, sorry. Right. Schindler to be able to corrupt the guards so that he can save lives. You don't want the bad rules to start with. If you got them, it's better to have the corruption.
To allow, to get around those rules.
Yeah, so what we were trying to show is actually in countries that have good economic freedom, corruption's bad. But in countries that don't have much economic freedom, it gets you around the bad rules. And it sounds like the shadow economy is kind of
largely the same thing, yeah.
Yeah, so other than so we talked about regulations, they need fewer rules to start up a business and stuff like that. Lower tax rates, what else?
Generally a smaller welfare state is going to help with reducing your shadow economy. Allowing access to a court system and having property rights is going to help a lot. So a lot of the shadow economy that you see in these developing countries is in the rural areas where they can't get access to like the court system easily because those are all out in the city. So just reforming like the court system and having better rule of law in those countries is going to reduce the need to operate in the shadows.
I'm very sympathetic to this message. I mean, we run the Free Market Institute here at Texas Tech, and it sounds like given free markets, you don't have a big shadow. If you have not very free markets, you need a great big shadow in order to get by. That's basically the punchline?
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you for joining us today,
Thank
Kate,
you.
and for joining the Free Market Institute more generally. And we'll have to have you back on more often
Sounds good.
over the course of the academic year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's show. I know I did. And if you could keep up with us fast-talking New Englanders in the first half, I think there was a whole lot there that the United States could learn from. Japan had its housing bubble and tried fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus to get things going again. And really, it just prevented the readjustment that their economy needed. And it sounds a whole lot like what Bush and Obama have been doing in response to the housing bubble that happened in the United States. Luckily, we're finally starting to adjust here, and it sounds like the last 10 years, Japan has finally started adjusting too. With our second guest, I think we got a great big warning of what will happen if our institutions, namely our economic freedoms here in the United States, continue to deteriorate. We're going to see a growth in the shadow economy. For now, let's not hope not. Join us next time.